The Twitter files came out and really exposed a lot of this. Mark Zuckerberg came out and exposed that publicly, saying the government went to Meta or Facebook and said, hey, you need to censor this, this, and that because we don't like it. It's inconvenient for us. And so, people talk about this kind of freedom of speech in the West and so on, but even that is a bit of an illusion, isn't it? When the state, one of the most powerful government that's ever existed in the world, is saying to people, hey, it's a nice business you got there, it'd be a shame if something happened to it, and hey, I would like you to censor X, Y, and Z stories.
Do you see yourself as a journalist in any way? If so, why?
It's an interesting question because I think if you had asked me a few years ago, I guess my perception of journalists were just kind of a bunch of left-wing activists who pretend to be this kind of neutral, objective journalist. And so I think my reaction a few years ago would have been, oh, I'm not a journalist, I don't like the way those guys act. Nowadays, I think the perception is shifting a little bit, that people are starting to understand this idea of alternative media, and you don't have to just go and get your news from the big, let's say, corporate legacy media outlets. And now there's a real range. Now, there's no perfect. There are flaws also with alternative media. So I think my role nowadays is basically I'm a Bitcoin talk show host, in a sense. That's what I do. And then also I spend a lot of time trying to help educate people about things like Bitcoin, Austrian economics, liberty, libertarian ideas. So that's where I see myself. And yeah, I guess, maybe in a loose sense, I am a journalist in that sense. But I don't really market myself as one. I just think of myself as I just host a Bitcoin show.
Would you say you're approaching your podcast the same way when you first started? Have there been any significant changes or evolutions?
Yeah, so I started the podcast in July of 2018. So what is it, 6 and a bit years now. So in terms of why I started, at the time, it was actually frustration. I was frustrated with the options that were available at the time because it was always random shitcoin pumping and dumping shows, and it was blockchain this, blockchain that, and just crazy. And there wasn't really somebody who was really curating and doing Bitcoin-focused material in the way that I would like to. So in a way, people say scratch your own itch, right? And so in a sense, I was doing that. Now, at the time, there were very few other Bitcoin podcasts, right? At that time, it was basically Marty Bent and the Noted guys and What Bitcoin Did. And even he was still kind of doing shitcoin promotion stuff, or not quite, but it just felt a bit more shitcoiny back in those days, or at least. And so my podcast was just started as just to solve my own problem and to put out a curated list of experts and interviews. And so that's how I saw it, at least in those days. Now, it was a side hobby. It wasn't my job. I just did it on the side because I wanted that to exist. Nowadays, in 2024, I think in terms of my approach, a lot of things are still similar in terms of finding what I think is interesting, either at least to me, or I think it would be interesting for listeners of my show to learn more about something, whether it's a technical perspective or an economic perspective. And so some aspects have changed over time. Like, for example, I do video now as well, not just audio only. And sometimes I try and do some in-person interviews here and there. But mostly the formula is the same. It's basically me just interviewing people who I think have interesting perspectives, or maybe there's a new technology, or there's some reason for, let's say it's a debate, or there's some reason that I think the community would benefit from having this podcast episode out there. And so that's how I think of it nowadays.
From your perspective, what is the main issue with mainstream media? Why do they constantly misrepresent Bitcoin?
I think there's this concept of a cathedral. It's sort of like a decentralized group of people, many of whom it's through university, right? So they sort of went to the same universities, and then they often have the same kinds of viewpoints. As an example, they might all think of it as their job to criticize Trump, just as an example, right? Whether you like or dislike Trump. But you can kind of understand that many of these people in the corporate media outlets, they see it in a kind of decentralized sense. They kind of all look for a way to kind of police each other or police a certain narrative. And I think that's where a lot of the everyday people saw frustration with that, because they see it like, wait, these guys aren't really telling the stories that should be told. Sometimes they lie, other times they don't lie, but they sort of lie by omission, right? So they might sort of put correct facts, but sort of present the story in a very different way. And so I think that is probably why there's been a lot of loss of trust in the typical mainstream media outlets, especially post-2020 with the COVID tyranny. I think a lot of people have started to see, now there's still a lot of people who still believe that stuff, but their trust level is dropping dramatically. So that's why we have this alternative media, this podcasting, and people doing Substack and newsletters and their own forms of media. And so I think now in the Bitcoin and open source world, we have that. We have our own forms of media. We have our own ways of getting messages out there that are not regime approved, let's say. And so I think that's been the big shift. And I think that's, to answer your question about why don't they cover things in the same way, many times they are indoctrinated into a certain way of thinking, and oftentimes that happens at university, or it happens in the media as well. They sort of propagandize. And now you could also take an angle of looking at someone like Mike Benz, who kind of explains how there's all this US government interference, like that the CIA or other government entities pay for this kind of, they have actors who go to work at some of these media outlets, or they go to try and control the social media companies to, again, control what narratives happen. And the Twitter files came out and really exposed a lot of this. Mark Zuckerberg came out and exposed that publicly, saying the government went to Meta or Facebook and said, hey, you need to censor this, this, and that because we don't like it. It's inconvenient for us. And so, people talk about this kind of freedom of speech in the West and so on, but even that is a bit of an illusion, isn't it? When the state, one of the most powerful government that's ever existed in the world, is saying to people, hey, it's a nice business you got there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. And hey, I would like you to censor X, Y, and Z stories. So, freedom of speech, it's a great idea. In practice, does it really exist? That's, it's questionable.
Is Bitcoin misrepresented due to an agenda or ignorance?
Hard to say. I mean, yeah, in some cases it is just ignorance, right? It's because people don't learn about Murray Rothbard and Ludwig von Mises in their schools and universities. So they have, in a way, let me put it this way. It's like, it's hard to think about a concept if you don't have a word for it. And, there are writers in history who've written about that kind of idea. And so I think it's a similar thing where a lot of people are just kind of presented this idea, oh, the state controls the money, and without us, you would all be, much poorer or much worse off. And so some people just believe it. But on the other hand, yeah, I believe there are elements of, let's say, state-driven propaganda or state-driven censorship, as I was explaining before. So I think there's an element of that, and maybe in certain organizations, this notion of, if you're sort of challenging the narrative a bit too much, then maybe you get deprioritized a bit, or maybe you get fired because you're not allowed to criticize certain things. You're not allowed to say certain things. So I think it's a combination of those factors, right? Like some of it's ignorance, some of it is just, or another way to put it is, you're going to get a lot more government funding. You're going to get a lot more if you kind of just swim with the tide, it's hard to swim against the tide. So maybe it's a bit like that too. Like if you sort of do the things that the regime likes in a kind of decentralized cathedral way, they sort of reward their friends who are helping them push a certain narrative that's kind of beneficial for the regime. I'll give you another quick example, right? In terms of economics jobs, a lot of economics jobs are at the central banks of different countries. So you can understand why it's very difficult to get hired as somebody who's critical of central banks at the central bank when most of the jobs are there, or a lot of the economics jobs are there. So I think part of it is the incentives. It's hard, it's hard to bite the hand that feeds you. That's just a natural thing. None of us are immune from that.
As a successful podcaster, what's your secret to building a strong audience and platform?
I guess for me, right time, right place. I think some of it was just, at the time, I was one of the only games in town, as I said, that there weren't a lot of people. Nowadays, it's actually a very different environment. There's so much content and material out there in terms of podcasts and books and articles and all these things. Now, for me, I think the things that helped me were skillful curation, putting in a lot of research, good guest selection. I think those are things that helped me in terms of getting noticed, because I guess nowadays it's difficult to get noticed. And let's say the environment is constantly shifting as well. So as an example, maybe to be competitive, you have to do more short form content, or maybe you need to sort of have better level editing or better set and things like this. For me, I'm not necessarily trying to be the biggest show or the most, to me it's more just I do a show on what I find interesting. If I find it interesting, then I think it will show through as well. So I think that's another aspect, is that the host's passion for a particular topic can sort of bleed through to the listeners. And so let's say I'm really passionate about Bitcoin, then people are listening to the show and they sort of, yeah, Bitcoin is this amazing thing. Like, it's so it's sort of, there's in a way, a relationship between the podcast host or the content creator and the listeners or the viewers or chat, as people say, chat, whatever, right? So I think it's a little bit of that. It's a combination of those things. But look, some of it was just luck, right? Right place, right time. Like at the time, there just wasn't there weren't people doing what I was doing. I was relatively unique. Like there were a few other people, but just not that many. Nowadays, there's so many. So I think it's really evolved and changed over time.
Do you foresee Bitcoin native journalism emerging? Will Bitcoin disrupt the incentives of the information industry?
Maybe not as popular opinion, but I think some Bitcoiners have this view of like, we just need to do away with the ads and just everything should just be like crowdsourced or donation funded or Zaps or Nostra, this kind of thing. I just think that is probably not going to be sustainable for people who are actually going to do that as a full-time job, because the amount you make from that is just not that much. In reality, in practice, you often need sponsors or advertisers to really earn enough to make it worthwhile for somebody to do that as a full-time job. Now, that said, you might find some people who do it at a hobby level, right? They might have some other job, some other income, they may be independently wealthy, but they just decide because they want to do this because they want it to exist, So I think it'll be a mix of those things. I will also say, I think a lot of people don't understand how important it is to put out your own message, because I think there are times where, maybe in history there might have been times where there was kind of like a revolution or a revolt against rich people or whatever, and maybe if those rich people had done better at actually putting out their message and explaining why they were doing a good thing for society, maybe there wouldn't have been a revolution. Maybe if they could have. Now, I mean, you could argue either way, right? But I guess historically there used to be this sense of, let's say, noblesse oblige, right? This idea that you should help out the people who are less fortunate than yourself. I think society's lost a bit of that now. It sort of seems like we have these very selfish parasite or predator elites in the world today, and hopefully Bitcoin can help some of that. But I mean, I also have to be honest. Like nobody's immune, right? We could all be, be bought out or kind of silenced in a certain way. So I think it's important. Yeah, people should try to be honest and try to bring accountability and ask good questions and cover the things that the people need to know and need to learn. So in terms of where it's going in the future, I don't think advertising is totally going to go away, but I think there is certainly an opportunity now for this, as an example, Substack, right? This idea that you could just be sponsored in a sense by your subscribers. But I mean, whatever model you choose, there's going to be, to an extent, an opportunity for, let's say, capture, or that, as an example, if you were only paid by people subscribing, you could argue the same kind of argument people made against, let's say, the New York Times or whatever, or some of these kind of mainstream corporate media outlets, is that they are so captured by their subscriber base that they only write things that the subscriber base likes. And so, there's not really an answer, right? There's not really a perfect answer because maybe there is a space for people to have advertisers but be selective about who they choose as those advertisers. But of course there's downsides to that too, right? Because maybe you choose an advertiser and they turn out to be bad or they make a big mistake. So I mean, there's no real perfect. I think it's just, Bitcoin doesn't make us immune to kind of bad influences. So I just think it'll be an alternative. It will just offer a way for people to be funded outside of the traditional, the historical means of getting funded. And hopefully that leads to a better, media environment. But yeah, I am not under kind of this illusion or this kind of fantasy that the media, where there's going to be this kind of new era of Bitcoin journalists who are perfect. And no, I think it's just a useful tool in the toolbox. But courage, honesty, decency, these things are still required.
Is this your first time in Lugano?
It is my third time. I've come in 22 and 23 for the prior Plan B forums.
Have you been to other Bitcoin circular economies?
Yeah, a few actually. So I've been obviously Bitcoin Beach, El Zonte. I have been to Bitcoin Island in the Philippines. Yeah, I think those are probably the main two I've been to. Vietnam. There was one in Vietnam, but that was really not much of it. Not at that time. There weren't a lot of vendors taking it. So yeah, I think each of these circular economies, they've all got their own different vibe, their own style. Obviously, Lugano, it's here in Switzerland. It's all, it's got sort of high quality, more expensive goods. Whereas, let's say if you're in other circular economies, it's a different variety of services and products that are available.
Would you be coming back to Lugano?
Yeah, for sure. I enjoy my time when I'm here for Plan B Forum. Yeah, it's a good time.
What is your take on Tether's growth these past 10 years?
Yeah, I guess the outside perception would be maybe in the early years, Tether was this kind of, wildcat or kind of outlaw sort of thing, and nowadays it's sort of a lot more, let's say, regulatory and kind of collaborating with, government and law enforcement. It's grown massively. I think last I checked, it's 120 billion in terms of USDT, Tether. And yeah, I just think it's interesting to see that it's an option for people who don't have USD banking, and even for people who do have USD banking, they might prefer it. Maybe it's a bit lower friction as an option. So I think it is, it's going to be here to stay. And so Bitcoin and Tether and, they're just going to evolve, and the world is going to just get used to both of these things existing. Obviously, I always promote Bitcoin, but the way I see it is I shouldn't be sort of casting stones at stablecoin users, because sometimes you don't understand the situation that they're in, and often they don't have access to the same USD banking options or fiat credit and debit cards that those of us from the Western world have. So I accept and I understand it from that perspective.